Let's have a look at the different types of films that you might find when describing mainstream Hollywood movies or somehow more conventional types of cinema. We're not just going to talk about general genres, but we're going to delve into more specific sub-genres. We're not just going to talk about comedies, but different kinds of comedy. That's what I mean. If you think of this sort of umbrella term, historical films or epic films sometimes, there might be different subgenres. For example, a film such as Gone with the Wind might be called an epic film, for example. It is a melodrama as well, because typically films are not just one genre, okay? If you want to refer to these films that somehow describe stories related to the Bible, to the Old or the New Testament, which were very popular actually in the 1950s and 60s, you might talk about biblical films. Sometimes those that are also set in Greece or Rome, in the ancient world, might also be called peplum or pepla in the plural. Okay? If you think of literary adaptations, for example, like those based on novels by Jane Austen or something like that, you might say exactly that. They are adaptations. Okay? Sometimes you may refer to them as costume dramas. Costume as the kinds of clothes they're wearing. Okay? And a film such as Troy, for example, again, might be an epic film, because there are different wars involved. So probably that could be an epic film. If you think of this kind of film, or a film such as Gladiator, they sometimes may be referred to as sword and sandal films, especially those which are set in ancient Rome. Okay? All the films that you can see here have to do with crime. Okay, but each of them has a different approach to crime and who the protagonists are and where the focus is. So if you think of a film such as Knives Out, what you want to find out is who done it, who did it, who killed the victim. Okay, so yes, these kinds of films or books are called whodunits, an informal way of saying who did it. A very similar example might be Murder on the Orient Express and all the Agatha Christie kinds of books or adaptations of books by Agatha Christie. In the 1940s especially, there was a genre which became extremely popular, and that was film noir. Typically you could find the detective who is seduced by a femme fatale. Lauren Bacall, for example, Barbara Stanwyck, there were many femme fatales, okay? But as I said, it tends to be restricted to the 1940s and maybe 50s. There has been a sort of revival of these films later on, of course, so you might call them neo-noir films, because they somehow tend to imitate those film noirs of the 1940s and 50s. Then, of course, you have seminal films such as The Godfather, who are obviously gangster films. And finally, there is another subgenre which is somehow not as focused on the crime, but also on the trial. So these are called courtroom dramas. The screen capture comes from A Few Good Men, and basically the protagonist is the lawyer, the attorney, leading the case. So these are called courtroom dramas. All the films you can see here are different kinds of comedies, different subgenres within the genre of comedy. For example, when the humor comes or derives from something which apparently should not be laughing matter, for example, murder, this particular film, Horrible Bosses, the protagonists plot to kill their bosses. So when you derive fun from something like that, these are called black comedies. A more conventional subgenre within comedy are the so-called romantic comedies. Very easy to understand. You might find the expression romantic comedies, or sometimes simply rom-coms, shortened. There is another subgenre. For example, if you have a look at a film such as This is Spinal Tap. Spinal Tap is a fake band. They don't exist as a rock band. They were just created for the film. And the film is a fake documentary, a mock documentary of their experiences while on tour and the many mishaps they have while on tour. Because it is a fake documentary, a mock documentary, this is called a mockumentary. Because this is not true. It's a pretend documentary. Sometimes, when you have films that become extremely popular, such as, for example, The Hunger Games, the books, the films, etc., there are parodies of those films or books or stories. So, these kinds of parodies are called spoofs. So, this particular one, The Starving Games, not just Hunger, The Starving Games, would be a spoof. Or Scary Movie is a spoof of lots of different horror films. In a film such as There's Something Wrong with Mary, if you remember, many of the jokes come from, something which some people might find disgusting and gross. So these are called gross-out comedies. A terrible example in Spain would be a film such as Torrente. Some people might find it, really disgusting and offensive, but visually disgusting and gross. That's why they're called gross-out comedies. Films such as those starring Charles Chaplin and Laurel and Hardy, and nowadays still, they derived, the fun arose from watching people take a fall down, sleep on a banana peel, etc. So these kinds of comedies, of physical comedy, is called slapstick comedy. If you think of dramas, again, there are lots of subgenres within it. If the drama has to do with describing somebody's life, a celebrity's life, or a specific personality's life, such as, for example, The Imitation Game, which is based on the biography of mathematician Alan Turing, these are called biopics, because they are somehow a biographical picture. If you think of films such as The Notebook or Me Before You, for some people, they may regard them as just films exclusively for women. So they may call them women's films, or perhaps a bit derogatory, the term chick flick, which means a film just for chicks, a very nasty word to refer to a woman. So they might call them chick flick. You might say The Notebook may be dismissed as a chick flick, but in actual fact, and then say something positive. Another term that these films may be referred to as is a tearjerker. because apparently they bring about lots of tears. We've already talked about courtroom drama. When you have films such as 2012 or The Impossible or The Towering Inferno or 28 Days, which describe a disaster, a natural disaster happening, a fire in a building, you might call them disaster movies. It's a specific subgenre, disaster movies. And then finally, when you have a film that takes place while the main action takes place while the characters are on a road trip, you may call them road movies. Films such as Rain Man, Thelma and Louise, or more recently Green Book are called road movies because, as I said, the storyline takes place while the characters are on a road trip. If you think of horror films, again, there are many different kinds of subgenres within horror films. If you think of somehow 1940s, 1950s films, which were made with a very low budget, these were the so-called B movies. You had the main feature, but before the main film, the important film, you were shown a much shorter B movie, and many times they were horror movies. You have classic horror films, for example. If you think of a film such as Nightmare on Elm Street, for example, where you have the monster or the baddie tends to have these very, sharp nails, or they use knives. So this is the kind of film that is called a slasher film. Typically, as I say, including knives and people being slashed. Okay, sorry for the detail. And then some of these horror films include a serial killer, like Silence of the Lambs or Seven, for example. If you think of musicals, probably the most famous ones are those who were originally stage musicals, such as Evita, The Sound of Music. But then they were adapted for the screen. So these might be an adaptation of a stage musical. You also have some documentaries based on rock bands, such as Shine a Light, which was made by Martin Scorsese while following when the Rolling Stones were on tour. So that would be a rockumentary. Then you have some very famous biopics based on musicians' lives. For example, Bohemian Rhapsody, that's a biopic. However, a film such as Rocketman, if you've watched it, does not exclusively include, the songs as part of Elton John's career, but also the songs are part of a story. So in that case, you might call that a musical biography. Okay, finally, if you think of sci-fi films, science fiction films, there are many different subgenres within it. In the 1950s, there were some B-movies, which, aside from horror films, you could also find sci-fi films, just Invaders from Mars, The War of the Worlds, etc. So you might refer to some B-movies as well as 1950s sci-fi. Probably the most famous ones are the sort of dystopian science fiction films, such as Blade Runner, for example, or many of a genre. Dystopian means that somehow the future that these films are portraying is not very nice at all. You could also use this word if you think of Black Mirror, for example, a TV show. That's a dystopian vision of a future. Okay? In some of these science fiction films, what happens is that the world is going to come to an end. It's going to disappear, so that might be apocalyptic sci-fi. And finally, in some of them, you might find, artificial intelligence becoming too intelligent or taking over the world. That is not the case in Her, starring Joaquin Phoenix. But anyway, when artificial intelligence somehow becomes too relevant, these called AI sci-fi films. Anyway, coming to terms with all these expressions for genres and subgenres may be useful to you, especially when it comes to writing your review. So try and be as specific as possible, not just talk about the umbrella term, the general genre, but try and be as detailed and specific as possible.